So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Labour versus the farmers, and yeah, this is pretty interesting in the sense of, the farmers didn't really kick off that big over Brexit, but they're kicking off over this. It's kind of funny given that they lost their main export market, but we go on.
Reeves announced that from April 2026, so pretty soon, farms worth more than £1 million will face an effective inheritance tax rate of 20%, having previously been exempt. And we've heard, haven't we, farmers warning that this would make it more difficult for families to pass estates down the generations as they have done in the past. Our colleague Nick Watt at BBC Newsnight has been hearing that the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs has suggested various ways in which this policy could be softened. So perhaps you would exempt people over the age of 80 who wouldn't be able to find a way to pass down the farm in the coming years. But Treasury sources told BBC Newsnight there'll be no change to the policy. Interestingly, a lot of the focus in Westminster, and you saw it at Prime Minister's questions yesterday, understandably has been on the national insurance rise, which was the big ticket item of the budget. But actually, MP after MP from the Labour Party who I speak to says that's gone down okay among their constituents. Even
I think it's gone down okay because it's not going to impact most people directly. It'll impact them indirectly when it comes to salary increases and stuff like that. But I don't think it's going to impact most people unless they run a small business or a medium business, for example.
Among small and medium-sized businesses in their constituencies, but more and more rural MPs, and because of their success in the general election, Labour have quite a lot of rural MPs now, are warning about the damaging consequences politically.
I think this will be a losing ticket for a lot of these rural MPs. I think with the national insurance increase, I think, me personally, I don't even know employees paid national insurance, or they had to contribute towards national insurance. So, I mean, with this, I think this issue with the farmers will cut across a lot more differently. And this is Lisa Nandy being interviewed by a farmer.
Protect farmers, and I would just say to Gareth, I appreciate I'm not going to win him over on this programme, but do judge us by our actions, judge us by how you feel in 5 years' time.
Well, Gareth, do you want to respond?
I'm judging you by your actions already, with the promises that came and what you've delivered. This is going to be the last nail in the agricultural coffin. This country is going to need farmers once, twice or three times every day. Food security should be at the top. You should be looking at investing into agriculture to build the better Britain on our bellies, making sure the next generation has healthy, nutritional food. But what you're doing is you're going to push people out to the industry. And my family's been on this land for 375 years. It breaks my heart to think that I could be the last generation here. I want to pass this down to my boys and make sure that they can make a living. Right. You're taking that away from me,
Gareth,
and away from thousands of farmers in the United Kingdom.
Before I get Lisa to respond on that final point, particularly shame on you, Gareth, how much support, is there widespread support for this strike that you are joining?
Unbelievable, and it's not just widespread. I've got quite a big social media following, and a lot of people have been on board this morning, and a lot of the general public know there's going to be food inflations around the corner, and the poorer people,
I think if the food prices go up, I think people will blame farmers for it. I don't know if people will blame the government. And the other thing is, if there is a farmer strike coming in, I imagine a lot of the supermarkets will look to try and import food from abroad, and we might see some supply chain shifts as well. It would probably be temporary. I don't know how long they would last for, but again, you do need to be careful on if you overplay your hand effectively.
that Labour should be protecting are the ones that won't be able to afford the food, because we're going to have to put a 20% hike on our foods.
All right, well,
and they have to listen. Yes. They have to listen for once to the people that are on the coalface. Don't do what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners. Protect your farmers going forward. We need you to steer our agricultural sector for food security, to make sure we can feed the poorer people in our society.
All right, Gareth.
So, farmers are, looking at protesting. Apparently there's meant to be a big protest on the 19th of November, this video being recorded on the 18th. So we'll kind of see how that goes. And, depending on what happens, we'll kind of come back and maybe I'll do a video on it. Hundreds of protesters are opposing changes to inheritance tax rules for farms, gathering outside the Welsh Labour conferences. Starmer defended his government's recent budget measures, so you can see there was a big protest outside the speech area he was in. They're talking about farmers potentially blocking ports and disrupting food supply. I mean, Just Up Oil tried that kind of stuff, and they got put in jail for, some of those people got put in jail for multiple years. So are they going to do that to these farmers if they blockade ports, for example? Probably not. This account, it's not really worth covering. It's been community noted. Here you got a Labour MP discussing the situation.
At war with farmers. In the budget, we announced £5 billion.
Sorry, the audio's awful here.
For agriculture to boost food security and restore nature. And the budget.
The thing with this subsidy here, like, we don't even know where exactly it's going to, because we saw the Tories talk about changing the subsidies, the former EU subsidies, to kind of rewilding projects, which is fine and all, but that's not really going to generate food for the country. Is a rewilding project.
Also protected the Welsh Government's farming budget against a really difficult economic inheritance that we received after the election from the former Conservative government.
The farmers, though, are pointing not just to the inheritance tax, which they say will wipe out some families from being in a position to pass that on, but they talk about feed costs, subsidies and fear that with these assets being taxed, it will be the final nail in the coffin for agricultural life.
Well, let's deal with the facts here. If you are a farming couple, you can leave your estate to your children, and the estate can be up to £3 million in value before you start paying a single penny of inheritance tax because of all the reliefs that would be available to you. Once you do start paying inheritance tax on a value anything over £3 million, you're paying it at 20%, which is half the rate that non-farming estates pay, because the normal rate is 40%.
I do wonder how much this will cut through to the public, because these are enormous figures, and obviously the Labour government know these are enormous figures, and most people, some especially middle class people would know, like, if they were going to leave behind their house, for example, they would pay inheritance tax at a much higher click potentially for assets that are worth much less money compared to 3 million.
And additionally, you have 10 years in which to pay your inheritance tax bill. And what we do know is that around 500 farms across the UK each year will be affected by this budget change. And here in Wales, we expect the proportion of that 500 to be very small indeed, because
it's because land in Wales is worth less, I think, typically than land in like southeast England, where I think the land cost would be tremendously higher.
Nature of farming in Wales, where there are lots of small farms and farm holdings, so very few are going to reach that £3 million, which is the point at which that farming couple who want to pass.
You also have things like land inflation, where the value of land will go up just time goes on. And I think one of the main arguments that kind of farmers are using is they see themselves as custodians of the land, that they'll pass on to future generations.
We're angry because we can't carry on farming anymore. It's also demoralising. You don't farm for the profits, you farm for your kids. No one owns a farm, you look after it to the next generation. When you're going to lose 20% of all you've ever worked for, your ancestors have worked for, people are very angry. So it means that a farm every 20, 35 years or whatever, when generations change and it gets a new manager or a new person in charge, it's just going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. 2 or 3 generations, it's gone. And the line that's came out of the government is it's only going to affect 565 farmers a year. We can't afford to lose 5 farms a year. We are a nation that's growing. There's nearly 70 million in the UK. We need to feed people, and it's farmers that produce that food.
Do you feel like Labour understands farmers?
I don't think any government recently has understood them, but this one particularly, I think they've rushed the budget. They've not looked at the figures. I think we're the fall guys. If it's
I think that to an extent I agree with. I think they have rushed the budget, and they boxed themselves in really badly. I've talked about this before a lot, and so they've decided to pick on a community that typically you want to go after a community that doesn't vote for you. It's a classic Tory trick that Labour seem to have picked up on. You go after a community that doesn't really vote for you, and I don't think farmers typically vote Tory or vote Lib Dem.
Strike that's needed if we're not listened to on the 19th. I can see that happening, but it won't just be farmers striking, it'll be everyone around us.
Tell us a bit about the protest that you've organised for Tuesday.
I don't want to let the numbers out the bag yet, but put it this way, you won't want to buy around. We're going to have a procession down Whitehall, round Parliament Square, led by children on pedal tractors. We've also got a big
He sounds incredibly disruptive. I wonder if the Met Police are going to be on this.
food bank collection as well happening here. Being farmers, we're kind of used to giving food away below the cost of production, but we want to remind the government that we produce food. We aren't rich landowners. We just look after that landscape and we grow the food for the...
I mean, if you own the land, that's worth, money that is over 3 million or over 1 million, you are a rich landowner. What you choose to do with that land, that's up to you, but you are inherently a rich landowner. In terms of the analysis, the government, the Treasury argued it only affect 28% of farms, but the data from the Department for Environment and Rural Affairs shows about 2/3 could be caught by the tax. So essentially the majority of, farms, by the looks of it, could be paying this, inheritance tax. So again, it's deceptive. People are being quite deceptive on the figures they use. Why is the Treasury one so different to the DEFRA one? And this is kind of a new kind of front on the culture war. In my opinion, this is Labour's kind of one of their opening salvos into their wing of their culture war, because they already attacked asylum seekers just like the Tories did anyways. But you got Zoe Gardner here saying the few farmers with the most valuable assets up in arms about losing loopholes that let them pass on immense wealth to families untaxed really don't see what a bad look it is. We're told those with lifestyle of a house in the country with a pony paddock need tax breaks. Give me a break. If so-called anti-establishment voice of the people politicians weren't a bunch of overprivileged charlatans themselves, they'd be calling this out. No one's worried about roads blocked by tractors in farm protests for tax-free wealth hoarding like they were about Just Stop Oil. And I see her point. These are, essentially, a lot of these people would be wealthy landowners. They can argue that they're cash poor, but they are asset rich. And so, the issue is that they're going to have to keep selling land. It's going to keep shrinking as they pass it down because of, the cost of land will go up as as time kind of goes on. So I can kind of see both sides of this. It's really hard to give an opinion in a sense. You've got this gentleman here talking about how kind of Labour rushed this policy out and kind of pushed this policy out and pushed it badly. More problems around the comms team. This former Tory advisor saying this, and I agree with him. I think they have kind of botched the delivery of this quite badly, especially because they didn't announce it before the election. So I think a lot of this stuff has caught people out.
You doing? You're saying it's just going to pan out. DEFRA and Treasury at the war. I mean, this doesn't sound like this has been a successful sort of measure from the Treasury. And again, and I made this point last time I was on Newsnight, they were throwing out so many policies ahead of that particular budget. I think this was rushed. I don't think it was particularly planned. I think they were hoping it was going to be inheritance tax they'd go on. I think they were hoping their Labour voters wouldn't care about this, but actually polling by More in Common last weekend said the majority of this country's voters do not agree with what's happening with farmers, and that over half of Labour's voters think that this was a wrong move by the Treasury.
OK.
So it's interesting, even Labour voters are against this move. I can see Liz Webster down here saying post-war settlement, pro-EU values to ensure we have food. Now the USA will feed you. And I think that's one of the things where, that's one of the main issues. Like, food security is so important that you don't want to weaken it, because it does weaken your hand in trade negotiations and might force you to import substandard food or beef up kind of border security in order to stop substandard food coming in. And that's one of the big problems we have in the UK as is. You got this long kind of interview where they play like loads of random songs. So I covered this during the live stream. I'm not going to really cover it too much here. But essentially, he accused Islam of running away, from this conference through the back door. And, it's just the disappointment around the inheritance tax. Okay, it's kind of hard to give an opinion because it's hard to side with these kind of farmers. It's a bit difficult to do so, and I kind of show both sides of it. Farmers head to Westminster to protest inheritance tax, but these are wealthy landowners, effectively wealthy in terms of assets, not necessarily in terms of cash. But they do provide a societal good in terms of giving the country food security, but also the fact that the UK does have quite cheap food. But I think that's mostly down to the supermarkets fighting each other rather than anything. And I think the power of the supermarkets has kind of, if we look at the things I think most impacting farmers, it's the input costs, so costs of fertilizer and seeds and whatever, which has gone up dramatically because of Brexit. Brexit, obviously, on multiple levels in terms of losing your main, making imports more difficult, but also making exports more difficult. So that's another problem. The kind of power the supermarkets have to dictate price, because the supermarkets essentially have, I think it's called a monopsony. They're the only buyer, or the main buyer, so that means they can dictate price, and they want to keep their prices kind of low in order to compete with each other. So these, I think, are the major problems that kind of impact farming, and they're arguing this inheritance tax is kind of the last straw regarding this. But I think this is an incredibly dark bit of this video.
Would you be able to say something about any conversation you've had with your son or your daughter about the succession, given the changes to APR and BPR in the budget?
To be fair, my children are very, very young, so I've not really been able to have that conversation. But one thing I will say is I've got a funeral to attend because of this budget.
Has a farmer already taken his life?
I've heard of 4, but one of them's a friend of mine.
And who do you blame for that?
Well, I know who he blames, but yeah.
Yeah. Would you be able to say?
So it's clear that for them to take their own lives because of the because of this tax law, at least what it's claimed to be, again, it's quite dark. I did want to try and find some polling on how did farmers vote. I think typically they vote Tory, and so because of that, it's one of them things where it's hard to feel sympathy for them, because as this kind of tweeter points out, what about the disabled people who took their own lives when the Tories brought in absolutely horrendous and demonising welfare policies, when they brought in PIP, or things like that. And so I'm not going to blame this farmer specifically, but where were they during all of this when they typically kept voting for the Conservative Party? I find it hard to have sympathy for them to that extent. Did want to discuss this segment as well.
I lost my right to live in Europe, to stay wherever I wanted. That's what farmers voted for. The country's £100 billion a year worse off. That's what farmers voted for, and now the government's trying to make up the shortfall. Farmers should suck it up.
In this election campaign, Labour ruled out changing IHT. That's what people voted for. They ruled out changing agricultural property relief. Where they were elected, it wasn't in their manifesto, but Steve Reed stood up on a platform and said, we will not be changing agricultural property relief. So if you use your argument...
Well, I mean, that's kind of a loser's bet there, because if it's not in the manifesto, who cares? That's one of the major problems. Like, if it's guaranteed within the manifesto, then you have a case. But, you took him at his word. The one thing you never do is you never take a politician at their word. Not really, you can argue manifestos are like that as well, but at least the media will do a much better job of holding them to account over manifestos, rather than, something random that Steve Reed said.
Farmers, people elected this government on the basis they would not change agricultural property relief.
That's not my argument. My argument is the farmers voted for something that's made this country £100 billion a year worse off. The government's looking at ways of making up that difference, and some farmers, a very small proportion of farmers, are going to have to pay a bit.
No, I mean, I think you're looking at this through completely the wrong lens. We have the 3rd cheapest food in the world. We have the cheapest food in Western Europe. And unfortunately, farms are not generating a great enough profit from producing the country's food, which I'm sure everyone listening to your programme wants to be able to access homegrown, high-quality British food 3 times a day. Unfortunately, the margins we're making from that are just so low. The reinvestment in our farms is going to suffer because of this change to inheritance tax.
I agree with all the difficulties that farmers are facing, but I'll say again, voting for Brexit has injured British farming. It's injured Britain. And
that is true. It has. That is one of the major things that did impact British farming, and I'm amazed that more farmers are not pushing for a dynamic alignment deal with the EU in order to kind of help our exports to the EU. In terms of stuff getting through the Dover-Calais crossing. I'm amazed that's not really happening.
And it seems only fair that those that favoured it should pay for it.
So, there's different ways of looking at it, and I think I'd side with Zoe Gardner, Matthew wrote on this one. Like, you know, they did consistently vote for bad governments who kind of screwed us over, and you know, they were lucky in the sense of they didn't have to pay inheritance tax for farms, and now, you know, it's the wealthier ones that have to pay for it. I kind of, it's tough because, you know, they argue they don't make a ton of, you know, profit from these farms, and you know, they reinvest it, whatever, right? So some of them do, some don't, right? Some of them are like kind of just not really just breaking even or making, you know, small amounts of money. So you know, food security is important. At the same time, like, you voted, you know, you kept voting for a party that screwed over the rest of the country. Like, it's very hard to feel sympathy for you now that you're on the receiving end of an L. I don't know. Maybe I'm seeing this. Maybe I am seeing this with the wrong lens. But in my opinion, it's hard to feel so much sympathy for them, especially when, you know, they do have a lot of assets. You know, they can have, you know, horses and stuff like that. And you know, the average person, if they want to pass down their house, that's worth, you know, I think it's like $250,000 or somewhere around that figure. You know, if they want to pass down their assets to their family, they've got to pay inheritance tax. And you know, the threshold for these farms begins at around like 1 to 3 million. I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling it. Maybe if we get Liz Webster on and we do another Sunday Race episode, we can discuss it. But right now, and you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, I'm siding with the Labour Party on this one. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.